So I want to talk to you guys about Intel's upcoming generation of low power mobile CPUs. So we're finally getting a replacement to the 11th generation of mobile CPUs like the 1135G7. Now this update is interesting in the sense that Intel is now separating their CPU SKUs into two different series. There's now a U series and a P series. So this U series is mostly going to be found on lower power and lower end systems, while the P series is really designated for high performance ultrabooks, so more premium devices. Now this is pretty significant because there was no real differentiator between the 1135G7 that was in a cheap laptop like the Gateway that was $500 or something like an HP Spectre that is a over $1,000 device. They were still using the same chip. It was the same 1135G7. At most, the differentiating factor would be the TDP and potentially the type of memory being used, but for the most part it was all the same. Now this was pretty great for low-end buyers because of the fact that you were essentially getting top-tier performance on low-end devices. So the chip that I really expect to be the replacement to the 1135G7 on the budget end is the i5-1235U. Now this is a 10-core CPU. We are talking about 2 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores. This is a radical departure from the core configuration that we have on the 1135G7, and it is a very welcome one because the bump from 4 cores all the way to 10 is really significant, especially because 4 cores, even hyper-threaded, is very limiting in today's computer market. Now, a big question that I have is for the U series, are we going to be able to actually adjust the TDPs of these? Because they're segmenting these products between the U series and the P series by TDP for the most part and core count depending on the CPU. So if the U series is stuck at the default 15 watts and you can't adjust that, that is going to be severely detrimental to performance. But I suspect by the very aggressive max turbo power that they have, that they're probably going to let you adjust things as much as you want, at least depending on the OEM that you go through. What I'm really curious to see is how this 2 performance cores, 8 efficiency core configuration is going to really compete, because there is a difference between the i5s in the U series and in the P series. In the P series, the i5s are actually 12 cores with them having 4 performance cores instead of just the 2. Pair that with the higher TDP and we now end up in a situation where there might be a very noticeable performance gap between the P series and the U series, and that is really mostly going to affect the low end of the market. And the worst part of all of this is that we are getting absolutely no GPU performance increases whatsoever. We are still stuck with the exact same Iris Xe architecture with the exact same number of execution units. So on the i5, we are still only going to have the 80 execution units. So really all these updates are doing is just making the low end of Intel's product stack competitive with AMD more than anything else. Because even if they get the CPU performance lead, they are going to be behind in terms of iGPU. And while I've already talked before about how I don't think RDNA 2 is going to be hitting any budget products whatsoever, and it's all going to be almost exclusively on the high end, it's still going to be important. It's still important to keep in mind that another generation of Vega is still going to be in the lead compared to Intel, because we already know that AMD is just going to be refreshing their Zen 3 based APUs. So now instead of having the 5800U and 5600U be this like kind of premium product, they are now going to be the low end of the product stack. Now, another thing to keep in mind though is that Intel is going to be launching their dedicated GPUs this year, and they do have some products that are meant to essentially compete with the MX450, where they are low power dedicated GPUs. And of course, Intel is talking about technology that they have that will apparently let the iGPU work with these low power dedicated GPUs to kind of simulate a higher performance GPU experience. Now, this has been technology that has been talked about and tried for decades now, and it has really mostly only worked on paper. If you have ever had an SLI system or a Crossfire system, or ever had one of those old APUs from AMD that actually let you crossfire with dedicated graphics, you'll know that all of this stuff is mostly very janky. Now, that's not to say that Intel can't pull it off, but history has shown that this is a different difficult thing to properly implement, and who knows if they are currently able to really do that. All of this is to pretty much just say that this upcoming generation from Intel is both interesting because we are finally getting some decent CPU performance that is actually going to enable these devices to really be some powerhouse systems, but we are going to be held back by these very, very weak iGPUs. And I currently don't have much faith that Intel is going to be able to execute properly with having this version of Crossfire that they have in their mind. But I'm more than happy to be very wrong on that prediction. And if Intel can actually nail this, this might actually prove to be a game changer. But really, I'm very curious to see how the low end of the product stacks are going to end up looking like this year, because so far it seems like things are moving up in price and performance isn't necessarily going to be keeping up with that, at least on the GPU side of things. CPUs seem to be going through a renaissance right now where we're getting some insane performance increases every generation, but it doesn't really amount to anything if the GPU is what's going to be holding you back most of the time. So we'll definitely have to keep an eye on Intel prices, and of course if I can find a cheap laptop that has a Alder Lake version of the 1135 G7, I will have to snag that and of course do some comparisons. But as it stands, I think I'm going to prioritize getting an RDNA 2 based iGPU before anything else. So if you would like to help support that, check out the affiliate links down below, or of course check out the donation link down below to help support funding that kind of an expense. But I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.